Hey now, today we're going to take a look at Shadows of Brimstone, Swamps of Death from Flying Frog Productions. And I'm not even going to bother to try and hold up the box for this game because it's big, it's heavy, tons of stuff is going to get dislodged if I try to hold it up right. You know what it looks like, that's fine. Okay. So this is a cooperative dungeon crawling game, and there seems to be a lot of those, and there's more coming out all the time. This one went for a unique theme, though, and by the way, this was a Kickstarter game about a year ago, maybe, something like that. The theme is that it takes place in an alternate Wild West where there's this town of Brimstone that was destroyed because they stumbled on this dark stone stuff, and it opened up a portal to essentially Cthulhu land. So this is Wild West meets Cthulhu. There's demons, there's unspeakable evils, you're keeping track of wounds, you're keeping track of sanity points, as in any good Cthulhu game. You take control of the sort of stereotypical Wild West people. In the Swamps of Death set, you have the Indian Scout, you have a priest who can essentially cast spells, you have a lawman, you have a rancher, and with male and female sides, and you work together to try to get through different scenarios. So it's also a scenario-based dungeon crawl. And by the way, I said in this set because there's two base sets of this game out, two full games. The other one is called Land of the Ancients, or Ancient something or other. I'm sorry, I'm blanking right now. Both of them can be played standalone, but you can mix and match some things, like the characters between the two sets. I don't know, I don't have the other set, so I can only report on this one for now. Let's go ahead and take a very, hopefully brief look at how the game is played, because there's a lot of stuff here. I could easily spend 40 minutes just talking about everything that comes in the box, but I don't want to do that, so let's just take a brief look, then we're going to come back, and I'll let you know what I think. This isn't even all of the components of the game, not even close. I just took a couple of the miniatures out to show you. There's lots more cards. These are only the cards for the mine part of this game. There's mines, and then there's swamps. This is just the mine. I just want to give you a taste of what you can look forward to in this game. Now, this is a fully cooperative game, and the goal is, well, really whatever the scenario tells you to do. So you have a whole adventure book that comes with the game that has a bunch of different scenarios for either the mines or the swamps, and there's even another basic scenario in the main rulebook of the game. Like any good campaign scenario game, there's more than one book that comes with it. And so whatever the scenario tells you to do, whatever the setup is, whatever the goals are, that's what you're going to have to accomplish. Many of the mine scenarios start with this opening mine shaft, but not necessarily. But the way the game works is you kind of build the map over time, figure out what your objectives are, and you can play this game either as just a one-shot, pick a scenario at random or by choice, and play it, or you can do a campaign mode where you just keep playing scenarios over and over again, playing as many as you can and leveling up your characters, gaining experience points like an RPG, gaining items, carrying it over, and so on and so forth. Oh, before I forget, like any good Flying Frog game, there's a CD soundtrack that comes with it. It's pretty bad. It's pretty useless, just like all the other soundtracks for the Flying Frog games. I don't know why they do that, and it's just a needless expense. I would have preferred that the game was like $5 cheaper and not have it in there. But anyways, it's there if you really need totally mediocre music to play alongside your game. So like I said, you'll pick a scenario, so you figure out what you want to do. Then everyone picks a character, and if you're doing campaign modes, you probably want to be very discerning with how you pick your character. But there's only 4 that comes with the Swamps of Death game. You have the Rancher and the Indian Scout, and they actually have male and female sides for all the character cards. You also have a Priest and a Lawman, who I don't have the cards out for. But here's what their miniatures look like. And yes, you do have to assemble all of the miniatures, which is kind of a pain in the butt, but just wanted to let you know that. And here I have the Rancher and the Indian Scout already out on the board. You can name your characters if you want to. Every character is going to also start off with starting gear as indicated by their character card, and that's what I have out here. Like the Indian has an Indian hatchet and a carbine rifle. The Rancher starts with a hunting rifle, and someone has to take an old lantern, which I'll get back to in a second. You'll also start with a personal item. The personal item is a really good thing. Usually has a special power, like my Rancher randomly got the Bear Claw, which says once per turn you may reroll a single willpower roll. And the Indian Scout has a weathered hat, which lets him re-roll a single defense roll once per turn. But you can also build story around these. You really are encouraged to make this into sort of a RPG in a box. You also have upgrade cards. You have 3 of them to choose from when you first get your character. And whatever you choose, you're kind of locked in. So again, you want to make sure that you customize your character the way you want it to be before you start, because you're kind of locked in after that. You have a side bag where you'll keep tokens. And tokens are like whiskey and bandages and dynamite. And those are just special items you can use during the course of the game. So you'll set it all up, you'll take your character, and then you'll begin. Now, movement in this game is roll and move. You don't have to do roll and move. You can choose to do a flat movement of 4. Either way you want to do it is fine. I've tried it both ways and it kind of works. So if you do the roll and move, you very simply just roll a die. Whatever your movement is, you get to move that many spaces. Movement in this game is pretty simple. Diagonals don't count as anything special. You can move orthogonal, diagonal. You just have to have at least 50% square in order for you to occupy that square. And of course, you can't stand in other people's spaces. You can move through allies, but not enemies, and so forth. Now, even if you choose to do a flat rate for movement, you still need to roll the movement die because you need to roll for grit. Grit, with a G, is something that characters have that is sort of a resource you can use to use special abilities, to re-roll dice if you want to. So you spend a grit, re-roll any dice as you want to. And like I said, activate some special abilities. So for instance, the upgrade card for my Rancher says that she can spend a grit to swing her double-handed rifle around and hit every enemy that's adjacent to her. She couldn't do that without a grit. The Indian Scout has one of his special upgrades, lets him spend a grit just to get +2 combat, which is essentially melee damage or melee to hits for the turn. So that is one of the main reasons for grit. And so even if you keep a flat rate for movement, you still want to go ahead and roll that die. One thing that you can always do in any tile, or any, main tile during the course of the game, or even in a passageway, is you can choose to scavenge. You can scavenge by, the way the turn order works is that you always will move, do an action, whether it's attack or search, scavenge, or explore, and then you have end of round cleanup. And also, actually, let me go back. There is one important thing that you need to do before you even move. At the start of the round, whoever has that lantern card that I described has to do a beat back the darkness check. Now, the lantern is important because it kind of keeps the room illuminated, and you can only have illumination to your tile and then the tile adjacent to that. So you can't really have party members getting split off too far and running ahead, because then they're going to be in darkness. But the more important thing with the lantern is whoever has that lantern at the start of the round is going to have to roll to beat back the darkness. This is very simply rolling 2 dice and trying to meet or beat the number on this depth track. Now, the depth track is telling you how dangerous things are as you proceed down into these mines. So at the bottom here, you have a 7 or more. This is the posse marker, your hero posse. All you have to do is roll a 7 or higher, and then you won't have to worry about the depth track at all at the start of the round. But eventually, you're probably going to screw up, and you're going to roll something low. But as you go further and further down into the mines, as you put more map tiles out, you have to move this posse marker down and down and down. And when you move the posse marker, you ignore the stuff on the board. But eventually you're going to cross these lines, and then the numbers at the bottom of the board get higher. That means that the threshold that you have to meet or beat gets higher for the beat back to darkness roll. And eventually you're going to fail on those darkness rolls, and this darkness token is going to move up. And if this token ever gets onto one of the bloodstained spots on the board, you have to draw one of the darkness cards, which is essentially the game working back against you and doing something nasty to you. So, for instance, you have cards like this, the Flood of Bats, which is exactly what it sounds like. Each hero takes 2 horror hits, gains 10 XP, and must then pass a Strength 4 test or lose a Darkstone. I'll show you another example. You have a Cave-In, which is also exactly what it sounds like. And lots of other things. Eruption of the Dead, which is going to you do an ambush of hungry dead after you. And Overwhelming Dread, which lets you draw one of the Growing Dread cards, which are like really bad darkness cards. And that's, actually, we'll go ahead and talk about that now, because another spot on the depth track, if I could, I'm sorry, let me focus. Another spot on the depth track is the Growing Dread. So you have to draw one of these Growing Dread cards. And these actually you hold on to the Growing Dread cards in a stack that you don't look at until you get to the final encounter, unless something tells you to resolve it right away. And these are usually really bad. So, for instance, let me focus here. This one is all heroes immediately take 2 sanity damage with no willpower saves. Dropped one. Here, this one is all heroes are, let's see, -1 initiative in the first turn of the next fight. So these are just things that are setting up the evilness, the darkness, as it were, to do better and better and for the heroes to do worse. And if the darkness ever gets all the way up to the mine entrance section, the very first spot on the board, the game is over. The heroes have lost because the darkness has escaped the mines and destroys all of the, well, let's just say it destroys the world. The other way the heroes can lose is if they all die before the end of the adventure. But let's think positive and get back to our example adventure and hope that things don't go so poorly for our sample heroes here. So, like I said, you can roll and move or just take a flat rate of movement, and you're going to keep exploring. Now, what I had started to talk about before I sidetracked myself because I forgot the darkness track was scavenging. So you have one opportunity to scavenge with your action. Your action can either be attack, search, or scavenge or explore. If you choose to scavenge, you're going to roll 3 dice, try to get as many 6s as you can. If you get at least 1 6, you have successfully scavenged. And for every 6 that you have, you get to draw one of these scavenge cards. 1/3 of them are bad things like monsters ambushing you, 1/3 of them are nothing, and 1/3 of them are items or loot, but at least, even no matter what happens, you get experience points for having done so. Experience points are going to let you level up. Now, the other thing that you can do is explore. If someone goes onto the half space tile, or half space square at the edge of an unexplored map tile, they get to draw one of the map deck cards for the terrain that they're in, look at whatever map tile it is, and then put it out on the board. Now, either I'm going to find this tile right away and it won't be a big deal, or through the magic of cinematography, you're going to see me fast forward to where I've actually found it. Ta-da! So you'll put out one of the whatever map tile it tells you to put out, and you'll seal off whatever entrance you're not using depending on the number of players with one of the little edge pieces. And then also, if you're doing the advanced rolls, you can choose to have a special encounter that is indicated at the bottom of the card, which means you're going to search the encounter deck for the mines or the swamps, whatever it might be, and pull out that particular card and resolve it. Other things are going to make you draw encounter cards as well, and those other things might be exploration tokens. So regardless of whether or not you do the advanced rolls and take one of those special encounter cards, every time you have a main piece of the board, like a big room, not just a passageway, but a big room, you're going to have an exploration token on it. An exploration token is always resolved at the end of the turn. You don't get to see what it is. You do all the other normal things that you can do. And if there happens to be enemies there with the exploration token, you can't resolve that yet either until the enemies are gone. But at the end of a round, when everything is fine, you explore, and then you flip it over and resolve whatever it is. So this particular one happens to say encounter. Now, the exclamation mark is used for particular scenarios. For instance, I kind of had in mind that we're doing the basic scenario. In the basic scenario, you need to find 2 tokens with the exclamation point on it to find a Darkstone deposit. Darkstone being these happy fellas here, which are just like a special kind of crystal that can enhance your weapons in this game. Weapons can be enhanced, by the way. That's another thing we don't have time to talk about. So, drawing an encounter card is simply taking the top card off of the encounter deck and doing whatever it says. It usually requires you to do some sort of check. That's about it. Well, I'll talk about it now. I might as well. This is a gateway to another world. Some cards are going to have you put out gateways, which are these things here, which will actually lead to different type parts of the world, like the swamps if you're already in the mine, or the mine if you're already in the swamps, and so on. If you have other base sets, they can mix together as well. Let's take another one. Like here's one, the rail switch, which is going to require a strength check. It may require one person to do a strength check. It may require multiple people to do a strength check, and so on. This one says, the rail track set into the dusty floor here, split off in 2 directions, and there is a switch box to change their path. But there's no rails there. Whatever. So those are just some examples of some of and there's usually positives and benefits and positives and negatives to either succeeding or failing at checks like that. But of course, as with any good dungeon crawler, you are eventually going to get into combat. So let's say that exploration token had one of these tokens instead. Now, up at the top of this token, that actually is another gateway symbol. But this one just says attack. And whenever a token tells you to attack, you're going to go to the threat deck. Now, these are low threat cards. But depending on the number of players that you have and the scenario that you're doing, you might use medium, high, or even epic threat cards. So you'll draw the top card off the threat deck, and it will tell you what enemies spawn. This one is tentacles. Lovely. And whenever you see that P square symbol, that is actually the peril die, which is a die that only has 4s, 5s, and 6s, I believe. You roll that die, and it'll tell you how many of those monsters come out. So let's just actually go ahead and do that. 6. Fantastic. Well, I actually don't have that many tentacles over here right now. But if I did, let's just use these happy fellas too. You will put them out on the board. They always go in like a checkerboard type pattern if possible. So you're skipping spaces starting from the top of the board and working your way down, putting them out evenly. And then because this is a fully cooperative game, they're kind of on autopilot. They always will move over and try to target someone, and they'll stay focused and targeted on that person. They won't change targets unless they're dead. And then the other monsters will try to spread out the hits to other heroes. But let's take a look at some of these models. We might as well. So there's one of the tentacles. Here's one of the Hellbats. Hellbats actually can switch targets. And they can fly, and they're pretty nasty as well. Here's one of the Slashers, which look like hook whores to me. And there's several different models for the undead, which are just zombies. And there's even these corpse piles, which will keep spitting out zombies. And there's always got to be one really powerful, annoying monster that only comes out with the epic cards, and that is the Harbinger. That is this really cheerful-looking fella that you really don't ever want to mess with if you can avoid it. Now, every type of monster group has their own character sheet, much like the heroes. They actually have a brutal side as well, and they may even gain elite abilities during the course of the game if characters level up too much or if some special cards force them to. A quick breakdown here. Initiative is very simple, like any RPG. In a combat, anyone who goes when you go into combat, you go into a new combat round out of normal rounds, and whoever has the highest initiative goes first. Ties go to the monsters. Here's their movement rate. Here's their escape. Now, if you're adjacent to a monster, you can't just immediately move away from them. You have to roll to escape. You just roll a die and hope to beat that number, then you can move away. This is their melee attack. They only have a melee attack, not ranged, and that's what they need to roll on a 6-sided die in order to hit. Combat is how many dice they get to roll in order to get those numbers, and every time they hit, they potentially do 3 damage. For monsters, their defense is just a static number that is subtracted from the damage that is dealt to them, and then that's how much health they have and how much experience points they give to the opponents. Weaker enemies just give you that one instance of XP if you're the one that dealt the killing blow. But for ones like the Slashers, oh, by the way, the tentacles have a special ability. They get to ignore the hero's defense on a 6. Slashers do automatic horror hits. Every time you take a horror hit, you have to roll willpower defense. If you fail, you're going to take a damage. And they also are less damaged by critical hits, which is what happens when you roll 6s. They actually have much more defense and more health. And because they're a stronger enemy, you do damage you get XP every time you wound them as well. And here's all the other there's Harbinger and all the other different types of monsters. Now, let's go ahead and break down what the heroes are capable of. So if you take a look at the Rancher card, and like I said, it's double-sided for male, female, but the same kind of things here. You have your combat rating, the max grit that you can have. You have your ranged and melee. For all the different skill tests, you have your different stats up here. There's your initiative. Special abilities that every character has. Health, sanity, physical defense, and then willpower. So I think it's just defense and willpower. So you might take wounds or sanity damage. And if you ever meet your max of either, you're essentially knocked out. If everyone's knocked out at the same time, you'll lose the game. If not, you can get revived after the fight is over. And combat, like I said, is very simple. You're trying to roll dice, however many, whatever your rating is, whatever your combat or range rating is, or shots that you have with a ranged weapon. You'll roll that many dice and hope to meet or beat the target number you have for a ranged or a melee attack, and then try to deal enough damage to get past the enemy's defense. For you, if you're taking hits, you just roll and try to meet or beat your defense and willpower numbers in order to effectively cancel out the hits. That's about all that's worth saying for combat for now. It's actually relatively simple. Just a few of these other things out here. Some cards will let you draw loot cards. Loot cards are only money that you're going to use when you go back to town, which I'm going to get to in a second. Gear cards, some cards will let you draw gear, which are just extra like guns and things that you might find. If you're lucky enough to find. They're not always necessarily easy to get. And you can actually sell weapons back at town as well in order to get more money. You might potentially get artifacts for the mine. And by the way, there are versions of these cards for the swamps as well. I just don't have them out here right this moment. And the last thing that I'm quickly going to show you, this game, like I said, there's a lot more that I just didn't have out on the table. But you have all of these cards here, which after you get done with an adventure, you have the opportunity to go back to town. And almost every one of these cards represent a different area in town, like the blacksmith, the church, the docks office. You have the frontier town, the frontier outpost, the general store, the saloon. And this board will actually keep track of, well, here you have depth events, which I didn't really cover, but whenever you roll doubles on the Beat Back the Darkness track, something nasty might happen to you. But this board actually will, when you go back to town, first you have to roll travel to see if there's any travel hazards that might affect you, but then you'll put your miniature in a certain spot, and that represents the place that your character is going when you go back to town. So maybe you're going to the docks office, maybe you're going to the blacksmith, and so on. But you can stay there for several days and go to a different spot every day and try to either buy goods or do some sort of other activity in order to help out your characters. You even have to choose whether you're staying at a campsite while you're staying in town, which might be bad for you. You have to roll on a hazard track for that as well. Or you can choose to stay at a hotel, but that's going to cost you $10. But just as an example, so let's say, and by the way, if you ever get completely KO'd without a revive token, you might have to roll an injury or madness chart to have some sort of crippling or debilitating injury. And also during the course of the game, I told you there's a lot to cover. You might gain corruption tokens and eventually gain mutations if you meet a certain threshold. But you might have random events that happen at all of these different spots in town. But if you go to the saloon, you can gamble, play poker, you can play craps, you can put on a performance, you can buy things like whiskey. If you go to the general store, you can buy guns and ammos, hats and armor, things like that. You can go to the frontier outpost and sell the dark stone that you've gathered, see if there's any bounties for the monsters you've already killed. Just so much stuff. I hope that this gave you some indication of just all the content that is in this game. It's really, really overwhelming. There's so much that you can do, and this is just one set. There's a whole other base set. So if there's anything else you want to know, hopefully you can do your own kind of research on it. But for right now, let's just go ahead and get to my final thoughts. Now, Flying Frog Productions is a company that is hit and miss for me. I really didn't like their games Last Night on Earth and A Touch of Evil, just not for me by any stretch of the imagination. But one of their games, Conquest of Planet Earth, is still in my collection because it is a lot of fun, at least if you play it cooperatively. So I didn't know what to expect going into Shadows of Brimstone. Completely different theme than any of their other games. Cthulhu meets the Old West, and I had some hesitance about that. I was like, I don't really think I need another Cthulhu game personally. I'm not into the Old West. At least this one doesn't have the cheesy live-action cosplay art of the other Flying Frog games. So who knows? I don't know what I was getting into with it. I know it made a lot of money on Kickstarter, but I thought, man, maybe that's just because of the miniatures and the gameplay is really nothing to be too excited about. But I'll tell you what, I've played this game a couple of times with a full complement of players. I've played it myself solo, taking control of several characters in order to go through the campaign mode a little bit. And I am very, very impressed with this game. I am really surprised by how impressed I am with it. There's a lot of story in this box, and I think that it comes closest to what I call an RPG in a box. I use that term when I'm referring to games like Descent and recently Imperial Assault and now Shadows of Brimstone. I think this is a really good example of that, probably the best example that I've seen. The game sort of goes out of its way to give you story to work with, where it's not just a mechanical rote thing of you just rolling dice and hoping for the best. You can actually have some very cool thematic elements to it. Let's go ahead and start from the beginning. Talk about the theme. I already mentioned that a little bit. I'm not totally sold on Old West meets Cthulhu, but I liked it better than I thought that I would. The Cthulhu thing kind of goes to the background at times because not every monster totally gives you that impression. I actually say that this is closer to just straight up fantasy meets the Old West because you've got like a demon and then what I call the hook horrors, which are the slashers, but they remind me of hook horrors from D&D. But it's okay, and I really like the artwork style here. Definitely I'm happy they're not using those photographic cosplay things from before. I like the whole comic book feel. It really gives that sort of pulpy feel to the game that I really appreciate. Component-wise, everything's okay. I was actually less thrilled with the miniatures than apparently a lot of other people are. I am not a miniatures aficionado by any stretch of the imagination, but I have quite a few board games at this point that have a lot of miniatures involved with them, like the Cool Mini or Not games. Those miniatures seem to blow Shadows of Brimstone's out of the water, hand in hand with the fact that you have to assemble these miniatures, and that is a colossal pain. There's not a ton of miniatures, but man, to me, it just seemed even more difficult than Super Dungeon Explorer's base set miniatures. Luckily, Soda Pop Miniatures wised up and are having them all come pre-assembled for the Super Dungeon Explorer line, but for this one, nothing felt intuitive when I was putting them together. They all seemed a little bit of a pain, even just getting them off the sprues. And then, that's another thing, at least Soda Pop just threw them all in a big bag for you off of the sprues. I don't know what's up with Flying Frog and why they couldn't do that, but I understand that some people love modeling. I just don't, and this was a big pain for me, and I don't think that the miniatures look that great. I mean, you have some like the I couldn't even store this guy in the box, the Harbinger demon, who looked pretty cool, but even he's a pain to put together, and maybe I'm just not a great modeler, but he doesn't seem to fit together all that well. I'd be very curious, I haven't really looked at it, what some serious modelers think about these miniatures, because I just don't think that they're that great. The map tiles look attractive, but it's really hard to see the lines that delineate the squares for your characters to move on, and it gets more difficult when you have the UV gloss finish they put on all the map tiles. That might make it look a little sharper, but it's definitely not the way I think that you want to go for board game map tiles. I think Descent had the right of it with that one and using a matte finish. Then again, maybe I'm just too into printing since that's my job. But the other stuff, the artwork I said already looks good, and the graphic design on the cards is very simple and laid out well. The rule book is pretty bad, but I knew that going in because it's Flying Frog. That's every rule book I've read from them is laid out in a very unintuitive way. There's some vital information especially about campaigns, the campaign mode that's in the campaign book, which makes some amount of sense, but there's some vital information there that really should be in the main rule book, and together with the rest of the information laid out in a much better way. Like the priest rules, why wouldn't those be in the main book? I don't know, it's very weird. And then even in the campaign book, there's some important information in the beginning, there's some important information in the back of the book, and in between is all the scenarios. Man, it just seems like they did not put a lot of effort into laying this out very well. But again, that's not a surprise. But I guarantee you will play this game the first time unless you've really done your homework and gone through the forums and looked at frequently asked questions and things. You're going to play the first game and get a lot of things wrong. That's just how it's going to work for this type of game because there's a ton of stuff going on. And as long as we're just getting some of the bad aspects of the game out of the way, this is a supremely fiddly game. There are tons of different cards. There are tons of different tokens. Depending on what scenario you're playing as, you might not use all of them, but you're going to use a lot of them. And yes, when you get to the more complicated scenarios, when you start traveling to other worlds and having to use both the mine and the swamp cards, it's going to get big and messy on your table. It really reminds me of Arkham Horror with some expansions thrown in, or Eldritch Horror by itself. That's just how this game is, and that's going to turn off some people. And I'll say this up front too, this is a quintessential Ameritrash game. Rolling a bunch of dice and hoping the best thing happens, having some mitigation over how the dice rolls come out in your favor, but sometimes you're just going to get screwed. It's that kind of game. And it's a cooperative game. So those are going to be nails in the coffins for a lot of people. But if those are your types of games, there's a lot to offer here. Now, I actually think that the main gameplay mode, as far as just going through the dungeons, is not terribly innovative. A lot of it felt very samey to me in other games that I've played. The dice rolling system is okay. I don't like that sometimes that sort of flits between working in different ways, like how you roll defense is different than how the monsters roll defense. They don't really roll at all, and then between the different characters, they behave differently as well. The priest and how he does is completely different from all the other characters, and how melee combat works is different, mostly different from how ranged works. That's a bit weird, although I do like that they streamlined a lot of the rules for line of sight and tried to make it as little complicated as possible. But it doesn't feel all that innovative. Making checks with the strength abilities, whatever, not that drastically different. I like that they did go out of their way to make characters as unique as possible, but a lot of it, again, is just starting gear. I have different starting gear than you, whatever. You can do the whole personal item thing, which gives you some amount of backstory that you could use. They really encourage you to work that into a backstory for your character, but most players, I think, are not going to do that, so it's just another item that you get. But what really, I think, makes it different as far as the straight-up dungeon crawling part is how you explore the tiles. I don't know how many other games have done this, if any other game has done this in quite this way, but having the randomly generated dungeon where you draw a card, put out a tile, and then if you use the advanced rules, which I do suggest, you get a different encounter depending on what tile it is, that's great. I really, really enjoyed flipping over a tile and seeing what comes next and really not knowing what's coming next. That's great. And while it might not seem to make thematic sense, like, was there just an infinite amount of random dungeons underneath this town of Brimstone? Well, no, it kind of makes sense because it's Cthulhu and or the dark demonic forces that are sort of influencing all of the lands surrounding the burned out husk of Brimstone in this alternate Wild West. So yeah, it makes sense that all of these dungeons would be twist and turn with all the influence of this dark stone. So that is a really cool aspect of it. And as far as I like the encounters, that adds a lot of flavor to it. And a lot of things are useless if you're not doing campaign mode, like getting loot. But if you are doing campaign mode, that kind of stuff really shines. And getting XP, although XP can be a little fiddly because monsters behave differently. Some are just straight up XP. Some of them are per wound. It's a bit weird. The whole threat thing is interesting. And the darkness track, moving up on the darkness track as you put with the player's posse marker as you go down through the dungeon and put out more tiles, makes it difficult to beat back the darkness. And as the darkness grows and gets stronger, it's going to be worse and worse for you, especially when you get those growing dread cards, which can pop later in the game and just really, really screw up your game. There's some interesting dynamics going on there, and again, this is fiddliness of the game because you're doing that every single turn, at least as far as I understand it, including on combat turns. Because how the game works is essentially you will go from a normal turn and then drop into combat as soon as it happens. So, because it always happens at the end of a round when you pop an exploration token, which is another cool aspect of the game. So it sounds like there's a lot going on here, and there is. There's a lot of different things, a lot of cards being drawn, different cards being used for different scenarios. The game, though, really encourages cooperative gameplay a lot more than many other cooperative games that I've played, because you will die if you don't work together. In my opinion, this is a very, very difficult game. And if you're playing this solo like I did, I really encourage you, even though it's a pain, to play with at least like 2 or 3 characters. Otherwise, you're going to die. And I played it with multiple actual physical players too, not just solo. But really, any way that you play it is going to be tough. And the game does scale. You get different threat cards and different amount of revive tokens. But the game also scales depending on the level of your players, assuming you do the campaign mode, and that is the best way to play this game. If you're not going to play this game campaign mode, I probably wouldn't bother with it. But with the campaign mode, it's kind of like Zombicide, where the highest level character determines the threats that you're going to be facing, or at least how strong the monsters are and how many elite abilities they have. So it really encourages you to think carefully about how you level up and not trying to hot dog it and keep other players back behind you and just be like the strongest person, because everyone else is going to die. And then if you might be the most powerful person in the group, but you're not going to be able to do much on your own. So it really encourages cooperative gameplay. All of that is well and good. The best part about this game has nothing to do with going through the dungeon. It has everything to do about what happens between adventures and you going down to the dungeon, and that is going back to town. That is the best part about this game. It is so interesting. Again, it adds a lot of different elements to keep track of and fiddliness to the game. It's essentially a whole other game that you start to play that is sort of interconnected to the other adventures on either end of it, but it is so interesting and great. It's not just, other dungeon crawling games. Hey, our adventure's over. Let's go to town. Lay out some item cards. Do we have enough money to get them? No? Yes? Okay, let's move on. This is, you're actually going to a location in town. You travel back to town. You might run into hazards. You have to decide whether to stay in a hotel or to camp, which might have hazards. Then each player, you have a certain amount of days. Each player goes to a different location and interacts there and has more events potentially happen, and then decides what they're going to do, buy stuff, interact with the locals, go to the saloon and gamble. All of these are different things. They all have their own mechanics, and it is so interesting. It could really be disastrous in some ways, but this is where the cooperative aspect comes in very heavily again, because yeah, it's fun to go to the saloon and gamble, but this isn't a solo video game RPG where you just gamble all your money and I'm like, okay, it's going to be a little bit harder for me on the next adventure. No, you're hurting the rest of your group if you frivolously waste your money. And that is another great thing to this game. It really helps flesh out the story and bring the game to life. And it's why I say that this is the closest to an RPG in a box that I think I've ever seen for a board game. There's a lot to love in Shadows of Brimstone. I think that, again, this is going to be a very divisive game in the sense that people who do not like cooperative games and people who don't like Ameritrash games should stay far, far away from this. And again, if you're not playing the campaign mode, you are really robbing yourself of the real joy of this game, I think, going to town and leveling up and all these different things. Even people who like Descent may have an issue with Shadows of Brimstone because there's no one versus all mechanic, which is a pretty interesting and vital part of Descent. And I think that this game is going to be longer and much more fiddlier, even, is that a word? Even than Descent. But man, I'll tell you, if you fall within those parameters of what you like in a game, this is definitely one to check out. I wish that a few things were different, but other than that, I was pleasantly surprised with Shadows of Brimstone, and it makes me eager to try the other base set, City of the Ancients, because that might even have a better theme for me with like a temple and jungle people and aliens, I heard, maybe? I don't know. But as it is, Shadows of Brimstone, Swamps of Death from Flying Cross Productions is a solid, entertaining game.